Aloha. Welcome to Light Drama Action. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe. And let's get to the content for today. Peace.
Before we begin, I want to offer a clear and firm warning. What you are about to hear contains graphic descriptions. This content is intended for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is strongly advised. And remember, all individuals mentioned in this video, including Mr. Combs, are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. If you're joining us for the first time, full summaries for days 1 through 19 are available on the video tab of this channel. Day 20 recap of Sean Diddy Combs trial. Day 20 of Sean Diddy Combs' federal trial unfolded in a Manhattan courtroom charged with tension and raw revelations. On the witness stand was a woman known only by the pseudonym Jane, a former girlfriend of Combs and a central accuser in the government sex trafficking case. Slender and poised with a determined set to her jaw, Jane spoke under immunity about the darkest corners of her relationship with the hip-hop mogul. Across from her, defense attorney Teny Geragos, a sharp-eyed young lawyer in a tailored suit, paced methodically. Geragos, the daughter of famed attorney Mark Geragos, had been brought onto Combs' legal team to help dismantle the prosecution's narrative. Before Geragos began her questioning of Jane, Judge Arun Subramanian addressed a defense motion that cast a pall over the morning. Subramanian, 45, the first South Asian judge on the Southern District of New York bench, presided with an affable but firm demeanor. In his crisp shirt sleeves and robes, he projected calm control as he ruled on the defense's bid for a mistrial. Combs' lawyers had dramatically accused prosecutors of knowingly eliciting false testimony from Bongolan about the alleged 2016 balcony incident. In a letter filed days earlier, the defense argued that travel records proved Combs was in New York at a Macy's appearance on the date Bongolan claimed he assaulted her in Los Angeles, making it physically impossible. The government knew or should have known this testimony was perjured. Combs' team thundered, calling the balcony tale a false narrative fed to the jury. Judge Subramanian, however, was unmoved. From the bench, he ruled that the defense had not met the strict legal test required to prove intentional prosecutorial misconduct. Rather than malice, the judge suggested, it was more plausible the government simply screwed up the timeline, a blunder that Combs' own attorney Nicole Westmoreland had seized as a Perry Mason moment to dramatically impeach Bongolan's story. With a measured tone, Judge Subramanian denied the mistrial motion and let the trial press on. The judge also swiftly rejected the prosecution's request to recall forensic psychologist Dr. Dawn Hughes. Dr. Hughes, an expert on intimate partner violence who had testified earlier about trauma bonds and coercive control, remained on standby in the corridor. Prosecutors had hoped to have her rebut some of the defense's new implications from Jane's testimony, but Judge Subramanian ruled her previous testimony, explaining why abuse victims may stay, delay reporting, or even show affection to their abusers, already gave the jury sufficient context. With those preliminary legal battles resolved, the focus returned fully to the witness stand and the much anticipated cross-examination of Jane. Geragos approached Jane with an almost predatory calm, a binder of notes in hand. Sean Combs, 55, sat at the defense table a few feet away, watching intently but betraying little emotion. Dressed in a dark tailored suit, Combs occasionally leaned over to whisper to lead attorney Mark Agnifilo, but mostly he kept his eyes on his former girlfriend as she braced herself for the onslaught. A small cadre of Combs' supporters, including his mother Janice Combs and his son Christian King Combs, observed from the gallery as they had throughout the trial. Jane had already recounted harrowing details in her direct testimony over the previous days. She testified that Combs groomed her into participating in what he dubbed hotel nights, marathon sex sessions with paid male escorts that he called freak-offs. She described how these encounters, often fueled by drugs and orchestrated by Combs' whims, left her feeling degraded and trapped. In one explosive episode on June 18, 2024, a romantic date night spiraled into brutal violence. As she tried to take a shower to calm down, Combs allegedly barged in and, rather than expressing remorse, demanded a freak-off with a male escort that same night. Trembling on the stand, Jane admitted she felt she had no choice but to comply with his shocking order. She testified that she had pleaded with Combs multiple times to stop these freak-offs, but she continued to perform in them because she felt trapped by Combs' control over her finances. Combs paid the rent on the Los Angeles home where she lived with her young child and covered her expenses. A golden cage that she said made her fear losing everything if she disobeyed him. This was the fraught context in which Geragos now began her cross-examination, determined to rewrite the narrative of coercion into one of consent. "Good afternoon." Geragos smiled coolly at the witness, her voice polite but edged with purpose. She wasted no time targeting Jane's financial entanglements with Combs, clearly aiming to suggest that Combs' generosity, not fear, motivated Jane's decisions. Geragos reminded the jury that Combs had hired and paid for Jane's attorney, the very lawyer sitting by Jane now, as she testified. "Despite Mr. Combs paying your legal fees, you've met with prosecutors 24 times, correct?" Geragos asked, her tone suggesting that Jane had been free to cooperate all along. Jane agreed calmly, affirming that Combs covering her lawyer did not prevent her from doing what she wanted, including extensive meetings with the government. Under Geragos' precise questioning, Jane also acknowledged she has immunity from prosecution for any crimes revealed in her testimony. The attorney's implication was subtle but clear. With legal protection and Combs footing her bills, perhaps Jane had nothing to lose or even something to gain by testifying as she did. Geragos then homed in on the material benefits Jane received during her 5-year relationship with Combs. She reminded jurors that Jane wasn't just a passive girlfriend, but an entrepreneur with her own swimwear and dress line, ventures Combs had infused with cash. "He invested $20,000 in your businesses, didn't he?" Geragos asked, one eyebrow arched. Jane admitted softly that Combs had, in fact, funded her fledgling fashion brand and that she had made a little bit of profit from it. "Has he ever asked you for any of that money back?" Geragos pressed. "No," the witness answered. "He's never asked you for a portion of your proceeds?" "No," Jane repeated, a slight shake of her head. Geragos let that sink in for a moment, and then the defense attorney pivoted to Jane's living situation. With surgical precision, she got Jane to confirm that after meeting Combs, her home life changed dramatically. The modest 1,400 square foot apartment where Jane once lived was exchanged for a sprawling 5,300 square foot house in a nice area of Los Angeles, the rent for which Combs still paid to this day. Jane admitted of the luxury and security Combs had provided. With each question, Geragos skillfully painted a picture of a woman whose standard of living had flourished under Combs' care. The subtext to the jury was unmistakable. How abused could Jane truly have felt if she willingly accepted these gifts? Throughout this exchange, Jane remained mostly composed, but traces of emotion flickered in her eyes. She had testified on direct that she felt love intertwined with manipulation, a psychological bind not easily unraveled. "I still love him," she had confessed of Combs, even as she resented him for what he'd put her through. In a poignant reflection, Jane had described the confusion of being drawn into Combs' decadent world. "I was hooked from the beginning without understanding the terms and conditions," as she said. "Once I did, my emotions were in place. Blurred lines emerged. I wanted to fulfill my duties as a good girlfriend." The words hung in the air, capturing the tragic mix of devotion and coercion at play. Now, under cross-examination, Geragos nodded sympathetically at that notion of blurred lines. The defense was deliberately blurring those lines further, trying to recast Jane not as a victim trapped by fear, but as a partner who made adult choices. After establishing the financial perks, Geragos shifted gears to highlight Jane's apparent enthusiasm for the very freak-offs she later labeled abusive. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a projector screen came to life with a transcript of text messages, explicit, exuberant messages that Jane had sent to Combs during their turbulent romance. Geragos, standing at an angle so the jury could read along, guided Jane through them. In one exchange following an especially decadent hotel night encounter, Jane had texted Combs, "I wish you were here." We can play our videos on TV and lock each other in the room all day. In that same breathless message, she gushed, I never climax so hard like that in my life. On the stand, Jane did not deny sending these words. Her own cheery text was now staring back at her in black and white. Geragos let the jurors linger on that line. The implication was powerful. Here was Jane in her own hand raving about her sexual satisfaction. It sounded nothing like a woman coerced, quite the opposite. Another message soon flashed up in which Jane had described one wild encounter as sexy, erotic, peppered with even more graphic detail that made a few jurors shift in their seats. Jane bit her lip as these private moments were read aloud, but Geragos' voice remained steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. If the text messages were titillating, the audio recordings were downright jarring. Jurors next heard snippets of intimate voice notes that Combs and Jane exchanged after a luxurious birthday trip to Turks in March 2023. A trip that Jane had testified was a bait-and-switch prelude to yet another hotel night. In one recording, Combs' distinctive baritone came through, playful, teasing. He joked that Jane was like a crack pipe, an addictive high, and reminisced about the great times they'd had on the island. You need to rest up, Combs said warmly on the tape, as if speaking to a lover pleasantly exhausted by pleasure. In reply, Jane's voice cooed with affection. She told him she'd had so much fun and called the trip incredible, saying it was on another level and had brought us closer. The tone of these recordings was intimate and loving, utterly belying the darkness that Jane now ascribed to that trip. The jurors glanced from the speakers to the petite woman on the stand, perhaps trying to reconcile these two versions of Jane, the eager partner on the recording versus the tearful accuser in court. Geragos paused, allowing the contrast to sink in. The defense attorney's unspoken message was clear. A woman who sounds euphoric and loving in private cannot easily be recast as a victim in public. But Jane was not meekly capitulating to this narrative. As Geragos probed into increasingly graphic territory, the witness began to push back, her voice gaining strength. She explained that she had tried to give Combs what he wanted because she feared losing him, a rationalization that cuts both ways. He typically doesn't want the boring romantic stuff, Jane told the jury candidly. He wants the debaucherous stuff. Debaucherous. The word hung in the air like a whiff of smoke. Geragos raised an eyebrow. So you were willing to do debaucherous things for him? She asked. Jane straightened a little in the witness chair. I knew that's what he liked, she responded, holding Geragos' gaze. I wanted to do something he liked. It was a revealing admission, one that both sides could seize on. To Geragos and the defense, it demonstrated agency. Jane was actively catering to Combs' desires. In that moment, Jane's testimony cut to the core question of the trial. They discussed a male escort named Paul who had frequently joined the couple's bedroom escapades. The chemistry among you, Mr. Combs and Paul, was so strong you even had a nickname, didn't you? Geragos asked, feigning a conversational tone. Yes, Jane admitted. The trio called themselves the Trifecta, comparing their sexual team-ups to a superstar basketball lineup. Combs was Michael Jordan, Paul was Shaquille O'Neal, and Jane dubbed herself Kobe Bryant. A few jurors blinked in surprise at this audacious analogy. Geragos allowed herself a thin smile. The absurdity of turning group sex into a sports fantasy seemed to bolster the defense's point. This was roleplay and fantasy, not kidnapping and chains. How did you find these other participants? Geragos went on, tilting her head. Here too, Jane had to acknowledge her own active role. She testified that she and Combs would scout for male partners together, even browsing pornography sites to identify candidates. Jane herself would send direct messages to the performers they found attractive. Geragos zeroed in on that. It was with the encouragement of your partner that she reached out. Jane agreed, meaning Combs egged her on but did not force her hand. In fact, he turned it into a sort of game. At one point, Geragos reminded the court Combs had goaded Jane by crudely urging her to chase a particular well-endowed actor. The defense lawyer's repetition of the lewd phrase caused a ripple in the courtroom, a mix of snickers and discomfort. which the judge quickly silenced with a glance. Geragos pressed on, emphasizing how Combs relied on Jane as an equal accomplice in these pursuits, not as a captive. She then broached a delicate episode that had come up earlier. One of the recruited men, a performer identified in court as Cobral, had secretly filmed a sex act with Jane and sold the tape to a media outlet. Jane admitted, "He was livid and pissed off on your behalf?" The lawyer continued. "Yes," the witness again responded. "He immediately tried to figure out how to stop it from being released, didn't he?" Geragos added. "Yes," said Jane. By drawing this out, the defense underscored that Combs wasn't a sadist reveling in her humiliation. When an outsider actually harmed Jane, Combs acted like a protective partner, angry and apologetic that she'd been hurt. It was a subtle rebuttal to the prosecution's portrait of Combs as the ultimate orchestrator of harm. As the cross-examination wore on into the afternoon, Geragos sought to undercut the idea that Combs ran a whole enterprise trafficking woman. Through her questioning, she suggested that the lurid activities were kept private, even secret within Combs' inner circle, hardly the workings of a sprawling criminal conspiracy. She highlighted a curious detail from the text logs. Combs had once texted Jane that he can't have escort Paul at my house and needed to take such rendezvous elsewhere. Geragos seized on this. Wasn't it true, she asked, that Combs shielded his household staff, his housekeeper, his personal assistants, even his children from these male escorts? He never let the hired partners set foot in his family home, choosing hotels instead. Jane had to agree. In fact, she acknowledged that Combs' own chief of staff, Christina Coram, had no knowledge at all that her boss was arranging wild trysts with Jane and other men. The defense drove this point home. If Combs was truly operating a sex trafficking ring, would he hide it from his closest employees? Or was it rather his personal kink that he compartmentalized away from his business and family life? By implying the latter, Geragos aimed to chip away at the prosecution's charge of a racketeering enterprise. To the defense, Combs wasn't a crime boss, just a man with secrets. The duel between Geragos and Jane hit a fever pitch when the questioning turned to jealousy and gifts. Geragos projected a series of text messages that revealed Jane's insecurity about other women in Combs' orbit. One message showed that Jane had once pointedly asked Combs whether he had given another girlfriend a coveted Chanel handbag. On the stand, Jane admitted she had posed that question to Combs in a text. "Did you ever get a Chanel bag from Mr. Combs?" the attorney asked coolly. "No," Jane replied. "I only got trauma." Her voice cracked as she said it, a flash of wry anger breaking through her composure. A few of Combs' supporters in the gallery exchanged uneasy glances at that bitter remark. Unfazed, Geragos moved to another example, a luxury Bottega Veneta purse that Combs had gifted to a different woman. "What is a Bottega bag? How much do those run?" Geragos asked slyly. Perhaps it was the insinuation that she cared about purses more than her own dignity that finally triggered Jane's temper. The witness leveled a sharp stare at the defense lawyer. "I'm sure you have one." Jane shot back acidly to Geragos' query. A ripple of astonishment passed through the courtroom, murmurs quickly hushed by a tap of Judge Subramanian's gavel. Geragos pursed her lips, momentarily taken aback by the witness's sarcasm. Regaining her rhythm, the attorney pressed, "How much do they cost?" It was then that Jane unleashed a retort that would headline the evening news feeds. With righteous fury, she countered, "How much does my body cost?" Her words rang out in the courtroom, echoing off the marble. A stunned silence fell. For a split second, Geragos was at a loss. The question hung in the air, how much does my body cost? Laying bare the ugliness of what was really being debated, was Jane essentially a kept woman, her pain offset by designer baubles? Or was she, as she implied, paying with her very body and soul for the luxuries Combs bestowed? At that explosive moment, Judge Subramanian intervened in the only way he could. Seeing the witness's composure fraying, he gently granted Jane's request for a short recess. The jurors were let out, and Jane visibly exhaled, her face flushed with emotion as she stepped down from the witness box for a break. Teny Geragos exchanged quiet words with Combs at the defense table. He placed a hand on her back in a brief, encouraging pat as she passed, the same subtle gesture of solidarity he'd shown earlier in the trial. Combs himself remained largely expressionless, but his eyes tracked Jane as she exited, flanked by U.S. Marshals. In that charged moment, the trial's emotional stakes were on full display. The cool poise of Geragos' cross had collided with the raw hurt of Jane's lived experience. When the jurors returned and the proceedings resumed, the atmosphere felt heavier, the earlier civility now strained. Geragos, ever composed, continued her cross-examination in a more measured tone. The remaining minutes of day 20 were spent revisiting a few final points, but the true fireworks had already gone off. Before 5 p.m., Judge Subramanian decided to adjourn for the day, noting that the cross-examination of Jane was still incomplete and would continue the following day. He gave the jury firm instructions to avoid all media and conversation about the case, then banged his gavel. Jane, eyes downcast, stepped away from the stand slowly, shoulders shaking slightly as she reclaimed her seat beside the prosecutors. Across the aisle, Combs stood up and buttoned his suit jacket, cutting an imposing figure. He glanced toward Jane, the briefest flicker of an unreadable expression before marshals led him out a side door back to detention. The spectators began to file out as well, buzzing with the day's revelations. In the aftermath of Day 20's testimony, legal analysts parsed the showdown they had just witnessed. Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed around defense attorney Geragos, who offered a tight-lipped smile but little comment. Meanwhile, pundits on the evening news were already debating what the jury would make of Jane's conflicting portrait. The trial had become, in the words of CNN legal analyst Joey Jackson, a referendum on coercion versus consent. At the end of the day, that is the issue, whether these women were not consenting but coerced and under his control, Jackson observed, explaining that proving a lack of consent is key to the sex trafficking charges. Prosecutors have methodically built a case that Combs was a puppeteer of fear and domination, using his wealth and influence to trap women like Cassie and Jane into degrading situations.